All right, and we're live. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to week 2 of our Family Ministry Thursdays here on TableTalk, reading through the Big Picture Story Bible. We're going to get started reading this in just a few minutes, but before we get started, I want to give everyone a few minutes to get on into the stream, get their technology settled, get their children settled, all of those things. So we're going to take a few minutes here beforehand. I want to thank Pastor Andrew for doing a great job filling in for me last week while I wasn't feeling very well. I am feeling much better now. Thank you for all who asked me how I was doing. Thank you for all who prayed for me. It's much appreciated, and I'm feeling much better. So thank you all very much. As usual, we are streaming live here this afternoon. If you're here watching live, welcome. We are glad you're here. But if you aren't able to catch this live for any reason, or if you are watching and you happen to miss something, this will all be recorded. This will all be up on our Facebook page. So if you missed anything and want to go back, or even if you just want to watch it again, it'll be there, and you can watch it as many times as you would like. So we are going through this great book right here, the Big Picture Story Bible. And this is an awesome book, not only for kids, but for adults as well. And this makes it a great book for families. So whether you are a child, or whether you are a parent of a child, or even if you have no children in your home, this is a great book for everybody, whether you are young or old, whether you have kids in your home or not. We are going to have a great time learning about God's Word together. This is the Big Picture Story Bible. This is a story about God's people in God's place under God's rule. Now, if you remember from last week, we learned about a lot of stuff. We learned that God created the world, and he created Adam and Eve. But Adam and Eve disobeyed God, and God had to kick them out of the good Garden of Eden. We learned that life outside the garden was terrible, and it made God very sad. And so God brought judgment onto the earth through the flood, but saved Noah and his family. And we learned all about how after the flood, God asked Abraham to leave his home and go to a new place. And God promised Abraham that he would make Abraham's descendants even more numerous than the stars in the sky. And that was where we left off. So we're going to learn a little bit more about what happened after God made this promise. I'm going to see here if I can get in nice and tight on this book so we can see all the pictures. So here we are. We're going to get reading here. We have part 5, God's people grow. Here we go. At last, it happened. God kept his promise to Abraham and gave him a son, Isaac. God's promise of a new people was beginning to grow. And so God's promise passed on from Abraham to Isaac. And when Isaac grew up, God gave him a son, Jacob. God's promise was beginning to grow and grow. And so God's promise passed on from Abraham to Isaac and then to Jacob. When Jacob grew up, God gave him 12 sons, and he named them Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Zebulun, Issachar, Dan, Gad, Asher, Naphtali, Joseph, and Benjamin. That is a big family with a lot of kids, and here they all are. God's promise was beginning to grow and grow and grow. But while God's people were growing in number, they also were growing apart. Jacob's many sons hated their younger brother Joseph. Here's Joseph right here. And they did an evil thing. They put him in a pit and then sold him to be a slave in a far away place. Here's Joseph being sold into slavery in Egypt. Isn't that sad? Do you think Joseph was all alone in faraway Egypt? No, he was not alone because God was with Joseph. And God was going to use this evil thing that happened to Joseph for good. God showed Joseph that in a few years there wouldn't be enough food for all the hungry people in the land. Joseph believed God. And Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, believed Joseph. He put Joseph in charge of the kingdom, and Joseph helped him by storing up food. There's all the food that Joseph stored up. Then came the time of trouble, just as God had said. People came from distant lands to buy the stored food. They were hungry and about to die. When Joseph's father Jacob heard that there was food in Egypt, he told his sons to go and buy some. So they went. And Joseph, now a very powerful man, recognized them. But his brothers didn't recognize Joseph. After all these years, Joseph could have gotten even with them. Joseph could have sold them as slaves, just like they did to him. Joseph could have even killed them, but instead, Joseph gave them food, and Joseph forgave them. He told them not to worry. He told them God had been with him in Egypt. He told them God had sent him ahead to Egypt so that God's people would not die. And soon, Jacob's family would begin to grow in Egypt. Now we're in part 6. This is God's people become great. Jacob moved his growing household to Egypt. Bags were packed, camels and donkeys were loaded with things, and everyone started out. There's everybody, lots and lots of people coming to Joseph in Egypt. First came Jacob, the son of Isaac, the grandson of Abraham. Here's Jacob here with Joseph. Next came Jacob's sons, and then came all their families. 70 people moved to Egypt. By now, God's promise of a great people was really growing. And God's promises kept growing long after Jacob and his sons died. After 400 years in Egypt, God's people had grown into a great nation named Israel. In fact, Israel had so many people that the land was filled with them. Do you think the Egyptians liked having all these people in their land? What do you think? No. Pharaoh, the king of the land, hated the people of Israel. Pharaoh hated Israel's God too. So he treated God's people like slaves. He made them work and work and work. He was so evil that he even killed some of God's people. God's people were in trouble, and they cried out to God for help, and God heard them. Do you see the little baby boy right here? He was God's answer to the people's cry for help. His name was Moses, and one day he would rescue God's people. When Moses grew up, God spoke to him. Moses listened to God, and then Moses did what God told him to do. He went to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and said God's words. "Let my people go." But the king said no. He did not listen to God. Moses told Pharaoh that if he disobeyed God's word, terrible things would happen to the Egyptians. Did that make the king decide to listen to God? No. Pharaoh still refused to let God's people go. So God made the river turn into blood. The entire land swarmed with frogs, and dust turned into gnats. But Pharaoh still refused to let God's people go. So God made the houses full of flies. The animals of Egypt got sick and died, and the people got painful sores. But Pharaoh still refused to let the people go. He even has sores all over his body, but he still refused to let God's people go. So God made hail fall from the sky, and locusts covered the ground, and darkness spread over the land. But Pharaoh still refused to let God's people go. Can you imagine what it would take for Pharaoh to let God's people go? Yeah. Chapter 7 is called God's Great Sign. God gave Moses a message for his people. Moses told God's people to take lambs and sacrifice them. He told them to put the blood over their front doors. The blood of the lamb was God's great sign. There they are, putting the blood on the front of their doors. That night the Lord took the lives of the firstborn in every home that did not have God's great sign. Many Egyptians died that night, but the Lord did not take the lives of the firstborn in any home that had blood over their doors. God passed over the families of Israel. At last, Pharaoh stopped pretending to be God. He listened to God and told God's people, "Go." Can you see the grandpas and grandmas, the men and women, the children and grandchildren, and all the flocks and herds all going? God kept his promise to Abraham. he did make him into a great nation. When God's people left Egypt, there were almost 1 million of them. And do you know what God did next? God gave this great nation his good word. Moses went up on a mountain to meet with God. The mountain shook and lightning flashed. God spoke to Moses, and then Moses told the people all that God had said. Here's Moses on the mountain. God is speaking to him, and there's all the fire and the lightning and even trumpets. If you see there, you've got 2 stone tablets. Those are the 10 Commandments. Moses told them how to love God. Moses told them how to love others. Moses told them how to live as God's people. And to make sure that no one would forget, Moses had God's word written down in God's holy book. But do you know what happened? Something sad. God's people still forgot God's word. Many of them doubted that God's word was good. Many of them disobeyed God's word. Many of them did not let God be king over them, just like Adam and Eve. So God punished his people. He made them live in the desert for a long, long time. But after 40 years, God was ready to keep another part of his promise. God was ready to bring his people into their own place. I think we have time for one more. So chapter 8, going into God's place. God's special place was called Canaan, and God chose a man named Joshua. There's Joshua right there, to lead his people into it. But there was a problem. Other people already lived in Canaan. They lived in cities like Jericho, with big, strong walls around them. Cities were filled with people who did not listen to God. God told Joshua, be strong and courageous. There's Joshua right at the base of the city, and the people of Jericho up above him. God told Joshua to have the people march around Jericho 6 days in a row. So the people marched and marched all day long. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 whole days they marched. Do you know what happened on the 7th day? When the trumpet sounded and when the people shouted, God kept his promise and the walls came tumbling down. God drove out their enemies. Then God's people lived in the land he had promised them. When Joshua was an old man, he reminded the people to obey God's word. Choose this day whom you will serve, Joshua said, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And the people said, we also will serve the Lord. On that day, many of God's good promises to Israel were fulfilled. Israel promised to be God's people. Israel promised to obey God's word. If they kept their promises, they would always live in God's promised place. But after Joshua died, Israel disobeyed God's word and rejected God from being king over them again. So God punished Israel. He let their enemies rule over them. During this time, the Philistines ruled God's people, and one of the Philistines was so big and strong that not one of God's people would fight him. Goliath was a giant. He stood over 9 feet tall. Goliath hated God's people, but all of the men of Israel were scared of him. All except one. Who do you think wasn't afraid of Goliath? Do you know his name? If you do, shout it out. David was from the little town of Bethlehem. David's belief in God's promise was big. David's trust in God's word was strong. So David decided to fight Goliath. He took his sling and a few stones and ran out to attack the giants. Do you know what happened next? God kept his promise to rescue his people. The first stone that flew from David's sling hit Goliath right between the eyes. David killed Goliath and rescued Israel from the Philistines. God was with David. God gave David victory over his enemies in many other battles. David, the mighty warrior, became king over all of God's people. David ruled over God's special place. Do you see David singing to God? He is thanking God for keeping his promises. Now that God's people were in God's place, it seemed that soon they would become a blessing to all the peoples of the earth, just like God had promised. So next week, we'll start reading in chapter 9, which is called God's Blessings Grow. Let's zoom out a little bit here. That's everything we've got for this week from the Big Picture Story Bible. Thank you all for watching. As I mentioned before, this will be not live, but recorded on our Facebook page. If you missed anything, if you want to go back and watch anything again, please do. It's available there for you. Just as an update for all the parents in our congregation, you probably received an email from me. We do have weekly Sunday school lessons that I'm emailing out every Sunday. So if you have any trouble accessing that, if you have any questions for me, please don't hesitate to shoot me an email. But thank you all for being here. To those who are live, it's wonderful to be here with you. I hope you all have a great rest of your week, a wonderful rest of the day, and we'll hope to see you all again on Sunday. Bye.